To address the opportunities and challenges presented by the increasing FDI from China to the U.S., we are assembling a panel of leading deal makers with M&A experience in the United States and China to share their experiences with us today. This session will focus on the differences that exist between China and the United States and the practices of M&A and what leading cross-border deal makers recommend to address them, specifically for the acquisition of U.S. businesses in China. I would like to now introduce you to our panelists. I'll ask a few questions, and if we have time, we'll allow you to ask some questions, and then we'll wrap this thing up and probably be done in about an hour. So I'd like to introduce you first to Stephen Toy. Stephen is Managing Director of W.L. Ross & Company. He's original founder in 2000. He is currently the chair of their firm's investment committee and member of the Office of the Chair. Before that, he was with Rothschilds and did M&A and restructure work. Stephen, it's a pleasure to know you and to meet you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next is Selig Sachs with Foley and Lardner. He is co-chair of the U.S. Greater China Corporate Practice, and he's a member of the firm's transactions and security business. What more can I say, but thank you for hosting this in your office today, Selig. And then to his left is Euan Rellie. Euan is joint founder and senior managing director of Business Development Asia, based in New York. Since co-founding BDA in '96, he has worked with U.S. and international companies in Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, India, and China. And he's had tremendous growth in the last year, and his people are doing wonderful things. So it's good to see you again. We were together last year. It's good seeing you. Next is Brenen Hofstadter. He is president and supervising principal of GCM. He has 20 years' experience selling privately held companies across the U.S. and Canada. Prior to joining GCM, he was a partner of a boutique M&A firm specializing in engineering industries. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
To his left is Joyce Demonteverde, is vice president of Castle Harlan. Prior to joining Castle Harlan, she was an investment professional with J.H. Whitney & Company, where she focused on investments across a number of industries, including consumer, specialty manufacturing, healthcare, and business services. And her resume goes on and on. It's very impressive. So, Joyce, it's a pleasure having you here. And last but not least is to our left, Al Ernest. Al is with East-West Associations and is a principal and senior operations leader. Prior to joining East-West, Al Ernest has more than 30 years of domestic and international experience in technical, manufacturing, and leadership positions with Owens Corning, which is an amazing company, and your achievements at Owens Corning are very impressive. And Al, it's a pleasure to have you here. So I've introduced you a little bit to our panel here. I'm going to ask a few questions of them, and then we'll open it up to the group. Seeing how Selig is hosting us today here, I'll pose the first question to Selig. Tell us about the focus of your firm, your M&A experience, and the unique services that you offer the Chinese direct investor.
Well, I think, well, thank you, Ed. We have an office in Shanghai, and we've been involved for many years also in working with U.S. and other companies in creating a presence in China itself, whether it's through acquisition, joint venture, or other forms of engagement. And by doing so, we have gained, I think, a good appreciation of the factors that are considered relevant from that end, the cultural differences and similarities, and they are considerable. So then it's very natural also that based upon those relationships, we would then be able to work with companies as they're now looking to deploy FDI here in the United States itself. And so from the decision-making process of Chinese companies looking at the United States is different from the United States itself. There are many layers and structures that have to be worked through. There's a lot of cultural differences that have to be taken into account. One is the way the negotiation process takes hold. I think Chinese companies have now learned that they cannot necessarily control the pace of negotiations here in the United States. That if they're in an auction environment or a situation like that, the deadlines are real. The time frames, for the most part, are adhered to. You can go back to CNOOC and Unical. People have various different interpretations as to why that deal did not go down. If you talk to some of the attorneys involved, it was really because of the lack of understanding for the Chinese part as to the deadlines and the process of acquisitions here in the United States itself. And I think what we're finding is a lot more understanding by Chinese-based companies of the process of acquiring here in the United States. I think also the process is being benefited by, as was referred to earlier in the session, of a number of executives now at Chinese enterprises who have had their education here in the United States, who have gone to business school, law school, undergraduate, have worked for a few years as well, so they bring as well a familiarity of the process here in the United States. And I think also what Chinese companies have learned is that perhaps the rotation policies that they've used historically of having somebody come to the United States, work for 2 or 3 years by way of rotation, finally be at a point that they can function credibly, and then having to go back to Beijing or Shanghai with another person replacing them, is perhaps not the most efficient and effective way of doing that as well. The other thing that I think has happened is that the role of experts and advisors is, I think, more and more appreciated for Chinese companies to work with experts who really are able to help them navigate the landscape. And it goes from valuation models, it goes to the due diligence process, and indeed how comprehensive at times the due diligence process is. As we're finding more and more, due diligence is not easy. It has to be done through a number of different processes to come up to the point in time. And then I think there's a lot more work being done these days on post-merger integration. So for example, you may have managers here in the United States after an acquisition who are reporting to people in China, and the individuals here, from a salary and benefits perspective, are earning a multiple of what the people who are higher than them in their hierarchy may otherwise be doing. How do you kind of bridge those differences as well? So I think more and more it's the question of creating teamwork, understanding and translating the cultures and environments one to the other, and really best understanding the strategic fit and how, by collaboration, the Chinese aspect and the U.S. aspect can best blend together.
Thank you very much. Euan, I'm going to ask you the same question about what I posed to. And I remember last year I chaired a panel, and the topic was culture in Asia, and I remember one of the things you said was, as Americans, we're not always really good listeners, and you said, if you can be anything, try and be a good listener. You can read all the books you want about culture, but if you're not a good listener, it can be a problem. So with that, maybe you could touch on that question again too, that Selig, just if you have some comments.
Well, it's a lesson that my colleagues try to teach me every day, because I love sitting up on the stage and talking for hours about how successful my firm is, and I should get better at listening too. But I suppose sensitivity is pretty important if you're going to do business across borders. I co-founded BDA 16 years ago because I thought one day there might be something called cross-border M&A in Asia, and I suppose this year we're discovering that that's actually true. And it's pretty exciting, actually, to see how much activity there is going on. But I would just say I think we're at the very, very early stages now. And so my firm, we have about 68 professionals in our company. About half of those people are based in China. We've got 20 in Shanghai. And then a bunch of other offices across Asia, Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, Hong Kong, Mumbai, Bahrain, London, and New York. And just about everything we do is cross-border. Historically, we used to work for Western companies who wanted to get bigger in Asia, and they'd pay us a few tens of thousands of dollars a month to go and hunt for deals in Asia, and we would hardly ever close deals. But they pay a few tens of thousands a month for long enough, it turns out to be an okay business. Luckily, since we wanted to be investment bankers, now we're able to close transactions. This year we will work for 50 clients, and we will close 20 transactions. So that gives you some sense of the percentage of deals that we're getting done. It's not easy. And in fact, we had a conversation in our executive committee this morning talking about where to allocate resources in the future. And someone pointed out that actually even today getting a deal done in China typically takes us a year, whereas quite often in Korea or Vietnam or Thailand or other parts of the world, we're able to close transactions much, much quicker in 4 or 6 months. So China remains a really difficult place to do business. I think it's still hard for Chinese companies to do business in the US, not only because there's political opposition from misguided politicians on both sides of the aisle here, but I think also simply, even today, Chinese companies typically don't have the depth of resources to get deals done. I'm still surprised when we get hired by a $200 million company from China that wants to buy a $50 million business in the US, and it takes 3 months to organize for the Chinese delegation to come over here, and the guy wants to see the Grand Canyon and have a couple of days in Las Vegas, and by the way, he might quite like to go and see the company that he's thinking about buying too. You know, we're at the early days, and you know, it's not surprising if you're a private equity firm today in the US selling a business and you get 3 offers, $70 million from a US company and $75 million from a French company and $80 million from a Chinese company, you're probably still going to discount the offer that you get from the Chinese company. Certainty of close is very important in our business, and we can't pretend there's certainty of close today on cross-border M&A. So just to wrap up, what we at BDA are trying to achieve is to increase the percentage of transactions that get closed, to give candid, insightful advice, clear advice that people can act on, and know when to tell people, you're just never going to get this deal done. It's quite important to recognize that sometimes.
Brenen, would you like to talk a little? Thank you very much, Euan. Brenen, would you like to talk a little bit about your firm and your experience overseas and what's going on in the U.S. and a little bit about your clients?
Well, happy to, and thank you, and it's an honor to be here. Yeah, I think for us, there's an opportunity. Our firm brings hundreds of private sellers to market each year in the U.S. and in Canada. We have a staff of about 250 professionals doing one thing, taking small privately held businesses to market and finding buyers. Most of the deals are acquired by industry companies and private equity groups in the U.S. and Canada, some in Europe, some in Japan, not many, if any, from China. And so I think there's an opportunity there because we do create a nice amount of deal flow each year. I think the challenges we see are what I call kind of the 4 S's. First is size. We're operating in the lower mid-market, which we define as between 3 and 100 million of transaction value. And when we're marketing our clients cross-border, often the 3 and 5 and $10 million transaction is just not big enough. And so I think that's a challenge. The second is speed, and Ian mentioned that a minute ago. We represent sellers that want to transact in a quick, quiet, confidential way, and they want to be able to go to market, get offers, and transact in a 6 to 9 month period. And often when we're dealing with large international firms, they're not able to operate that quickly. And I think that's a function, well, we know that's a function of staff and systems. In August, I sold a business to Konica Minolta out of Tokyo. The decision-making was being done in Tokyo, but they had 30 or 40 professionals in country handling on-site visits, due diligence, interviews, legal, accounting. And so it was able to go quite quickly, quite smoothly. There were some issues that got mistranslated to Tokyo that we had to deal with, but for the most part, having operating divisions in the U.S. being able to actively and speedily manage that process was very important. And I think to the extent that China continues to add staff and systems in country, that's going to be real help for us. And then fourthly, I would just say that from our clients' viewpoint, they're interested, they're mostly founders that we're representing, so they've built a business, they have wealth locked up in this private business, it's illiquid, and when they come to us, they want to sell, and they want to get liquidity. And so they're not really interested in joint ventures. They've been approached, perhaps, in the past by Chinese government or quasi-governmental business investment opportunities, and they're interested, but they're not interested in joint venture. They're not necessarily interested in unlocking foreign markets for their products. They're just looking for liquidity. And so to the extent that Chinese acquirers are willing to acquire 100%, or at least 80%, I think that's going to create opportunities for us at Generational to be able to transact more business. And then I guess finally I would say that when we meet with privately held clients and are engaged, for the most part, they don't have a predisposition to who the acquirer might be. They're completely open to a Chinese acquisition so long as the other parameters that we've just discussed can be met. Thank you.
Thank you. Change the question up a little bit, Joyce. Keep it interesting here, and you can kind of weave in Castle Harlan's experience in years. What, in your opinion, differentiates U.S. M&A from other international markets, and how does it compare to M&A in China?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think, Castle Harlan, we're a middle market private equity firm based here in New York. A lot of what we do is actually quite international, compared to maybe the average U.S. middle market private equity firm. A significant amount of our acquisitions are actually completely international, or if it's a U.S.-based company, has quite a bit of an international component to it. So I would say, and one thing that differentiates us is we also have an affiliate out in Sydney, Australia called CHAMP, which we helped establish back in the late 90s to focus on investments in the Australasian region. So I would say, just in terms of kind of comparing U.S. M&A to kind of other, to Chinese M&A, I think, one thing that we've seen kind of looking at a few Chinese middle market businesses, which we haven't yet pulled the trigger on, but is, there's a little bit of a valuation gap, I think, from where we are compared to where some of the, founder-owned middle market Chinese businesses are. We have spoken with multiple intermediaries looking at, middle market businesses and kind of looking at sort of the value expectations kind of in the double digits of EBITDA and sometimes double digits of revenues because of the high growth rate. Is a little bit of what we've seen with some of the smaller middle market businesses. But that being said, it's something that we are, very interested in kind of, sort of gaining those relationships with intermediaries and everything else. I think other than valuation, another challenge with Chinese M&A is obviously the regulatory approval process. Our affiliate CHAMP recently, within the past year, sold 75% of their interest in Manassan Foods to Bright Foods Group, which was the first Australian PE sale to a Chinese SOE. And that process was an interesting learning experience, just, being able to, be patient with respect to the conversations that began, call it a year earlier, the multiple months of regulatory approvals. So I think just being aware of that longer approval process and the uncertainty to close, in China is something that we're, kind of aware of and would need to be structured correctly in terms of the documentation and, the timing between signing and close and also the appropriate break fees, et cetera. I think another thing that we've sort of seen in looking at some Chinese companies is just some of the transparency in terms of really understanding the numbers and having that tie back to sort of, the actual data. I think there's just a different level of due diligence that you have to employ using the right intermediaries, and I think that's very important in China. And I think, we've actually looked at a U.S. company with a significant growth opportunity in China, but we've actually looked at it in partnership with a well-established Chinese private equity firm in order to really do due diligence on that side of the Chinese growth opportunity side of the business. And that experience was invaluable in terms of working with that local Chinese private equity firm who really had the extensive network and the ability to have feet on the ground and really conduct the due diligence needed. And ultimately we didn't move forward with that investment, but it was really an invaluable partnership and I think a really great collaboration that we're looking forward to doing more of.
Thank you very much. Hey, Stephen, I have a question for you. It's a little off script here, so you can kind of wing it. But we were chatting earlier, and W.L. Ross has a big portfolio. As you're looking to exit something in the U.S., does China, somebody in China is going to buy this business? Like, what's that process look like, and why or why not would China be somebody that you would entertain to buy a business from you, on an exit strategy, right?
Sure. No, that's a very interesting question and very apropos for, I think, the times of today. For those of you who don't know, at W.L. Ross, we are distressed private equity investors. We started investing in 1997, and we've got a very long and deep history in the Asian markets. We entered the Asian markets in '98. I myself, in fact, spent 2.5 years in Asia during the economic crisis in '98, '99, and 2000. And we, in fact, during that time period had raised an Asia-specific fund, which really focused on inward direct investment into Asia. But what was important with that fund is through that experience, we really learned some of the intricacies of dealing with the differences in the Asian markets and the U.S. markets. And I think the panel has done a very nice job of identifying a lot of them already. As Selig mentioned, there are the cultural issues, there are the timing issues, the legal and the regulatory issues. And having had that period of focusing exclusively with counterparties and having to deal with these types of overarching sort of macro dynamics and trying to put a deal together and understanding how very different the deal dynamics are versus dealing with just a U.S. or even a North American / Western European transaction has been invaluable. In terms of our firm, while we cover the globe in terms of investment mandate, we only have offices in New York, Beijing, Tokyo, and Mumbai. So it sort of gives you a flavor as to how much of a presence and how much importance we put in that region. In terms of our portfolio companies, we've been investing in Asia now for quite a number of years, both in China specifically, both directly into China and also through our portfolio companies. And one of the dynamics that we've started to see is as you mentioned, in the sell sides of our portfolios, as we're looking to exit. I would say 10 years ago, when we were looking to exit a U.S. or North American company, Chinese acquirers were nowhere on the radar screen. They just didn't come into the conversation. I'd say 5 years ago, they started to come into the discussion. They'd end up on the potential acquirers list, but we placed a relatively low priority that they could get a deal done. At the time, they were really looking at more sort of troubled situations, more bargain basement type transactions. And what we're seeing today is that's changed. Now they're looking for companies that provide strategic value, whether it's clearly in the resource sector, but even things in terms of buying up name brands and while it's an older transaction, sort of Lenovo would be sort of the classic one where you're trying to buy into a household name to build out your brand outside of China. Other things that we're doing that's interesting. We've got an investment in hydrofracking here in the U.S. and we've just announced that we're looking to take some of that technology into China, and that's something where we could envision some type of partnership formalizing in the very near future. So I think from where we are today and really since the sort of 2008, 2009 timeframe, we are seeing that in more and more instances as we look at what's the universe of players that we may be able to exit opportunities into, and particularly given the economic crisis and the fact that Western Europe and U.S. M&A is really at a pretty slow level right now as people kind of sit on their cash piles and not really want to do anything aggressive. That places more emphasis on, well, let's look at some of the more emerging places. Let's look at places where they have the capital, they have strategic rationale to come into the market, and they are starting to get more aggressive in how they're viewing M&A, and more times than not, that is taking us to China.
Thank you, Stephen. Al, last but not least, I want to stay on this topic of how the U.S. Can attract more Chinese dollars. We talk a lot about this foreign direct investment. There's some number out there. Last year, China invested close to $60 billion abroad, and the U.S. got a small percentage of that. So this whole topic of what can the U.S. do to be more competitive, because we believe that those dollars are going to get bigger, and what are other countries doing, and what can we do in the U.S. to make it easier to do business, I guess, in the U.S. You know? So,
well, I'll weave in a little bit.
Timely, yeah.
I'll weave in a little bit of east-west here. We actually ID acquisition targets. We do due diligence, operational due diligence, and then we carry that on through and do the transition and integration of an American company moving into China. One of the common themes that I've heard all afternoon has been culture. I think Dr. Euan said that know their mind and heart, for example. I'll tell you, I lived in China 14 years as an expat in Guangzhou and then Shanghai. Fortunate enough to travel all over with the sales guys, using my Guilo face to get them in the door, and really studied the culture. And I'm still only half inch versus 6 foot length. And my wife's Chinese, and I'm still learning every day. So we do it at a high level. We say, understand a little of the culture. And if I was going to say something that you really have to pay attention to, it would be know the businessman on the other side of the water. And to bring dollars here, I think an American company would often have an opportunity, but it can be fleeting. So when the opportunity comes, you need to know enough about the culture to jump on top of that. And if you can easily pass that by. You know, we talked about length of time, that's very Chinese. You know, to appreciate tenacity in a negotiation. Also trust. I think know their mind and heart was also said. Chinese culture is very much based on hierarchy and relationship, while ours is based on egalitarian and task. We couldn't be much further apart, really. So the bottom line is we need to understand that and how to work together. A great respect for Chinese businessmen and Chinese culture. But I think the bottom line is we got to step out of the American shell and be able to understand what they're looking for.
That's good. Euan, do you want to add something to that?
I think he's absolutely right. And you know, I didn't want to be disparaging about Chinese business leaders. We find that all the time. That there's a decisiveness about Chinese leaders that can be very rewarding. Tends to be, from our experience, even quite big Chinese companies operate in a somewhat hierarchical fashion, as you said. Sometimes there's one guy who'll make the decision, and you've got to figure out how to persuade that guy. You know, in the US, we spend a lot of time in diligence work addressing different tasks. With a Chinese transaction, you've got to find the right guy, and you've got to sell him on the transaction and do everything it takes to get him to cross the finish line, and often there's nothing you can do to help that happen. But generally speaking, I think patience and identifying the right guy are quite important.
And I got to add to that you know, the Chinese have an idiom that I really like, which is two people sleep in the same bed with different dreams. So when we talk, well, that could be. I wouldn't want to get into that. But the idea of the joint venture, you know, the idea of the joint venture, think about that, you know, when you're talking about a joint venture versus a wolf or a joint venture, period.
I just wanted to pick up on a few points. I think that Euan, you had mentioned about the length of time in China, and Joyce, the issues that are confronted there. I remember last year on a panel similar like this, Andy Rice from the Jordan Company, they've done about 40 acquisitions in China, mentioned that the amount that he spends on diligence in China is disproportionately higher than what they spend here in the United States, because you cannot take as much for granted. So the issue of financial reporting, the issue of supply relationships, the issue of conflicts of interest, because we know that CEOs are notorious for having interest in many different companies, and understanding those relationships are really quite important. So part of the length of time necessary is to do a credible diligence. I think perhaps, and to deal with the risk premium, because given the fact that there has been a poll cast on the level of Chinese accounting standards, really the only way that you can merge that difference between valuation expectations is by doing the diligence so you feel comfortable with it itself. On the US side, in terms of why Chinese companies, I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, by way of example, the Hawker Beechcraft bankruptcy. So when Perella Weinberg was doing their first cut of prospective buyers, 12 of the 15 were Chinese. Why? Because China and Asia is the growth market in the future for the corporate jet market. And with under the 12-year plan, and with opening up the ceiling below 13,000 feet, the statistics say there'll be a need to train 70,000 pilots between now and 2020. So if you are a seller and have identified that your real growth markets are there, then of course you have to bring the Chinese into the system. Now, Hawker Beechcraft did something very clever. In a year before the sale, they began to make sure that they were able to separate the military side of the technology from the commercial side, setting up firewalls, setting up different subsidiaries, meeting with CFIUS in advance as well to determine if in fact, to just outline to them what they were doing, so that when they were grooming the company for sale, they were dealing with some of the issues that obviously they were going to confront, down the road itself. And actually, Superior Aviation, which was in the lead position, but then again, the exclusivity period has expired, so who knows what's going to happen here. But they came up with something very unique, because otherwise the Hawker, the jet side of the business, was being mothballed. They essentially, as part of their $1.79 billion bid, front-ended $40 million in order to be able to keep that operation going, doing their diligence period itself. So I think a little creativity in terms of how you put together your bid, but at the same time, how you position your company for sale. If you believe that there's going to be sensitive areas for national security, is planning well spent to get the broadest audience as part of your bidding process.
Thank you, Selig. I think your comments are right on. Also, that the fact doing these international deals take a lot more time and a lot more money, especially in Asia. And Andrew, with the Jordan commenting, I was with Andrew in Sao Paulo a week and a half ago, and I can assure you his expenses and time, and it takes a little time, and he definitely had a lot of fun hanging out with Andrew in Sao Paulo. To that point, Joyce, maybe I could have you address that too. What can we do in the U.S.? There's a lot of discussion, recently in the news, et cetera, about the U.S. What are some of your comments on that? And
yeah, I mean, obviously some of the recent developments of what the U.S. has been blocking in terms of, Chinese transactions has been unfortunate for U.S.-China business relations. That being said, I think I saw some statistic where, 64 M&A and equity deals of Chinese money coming into the U.S. was done in 2011. Granted, a lot of that was sort of smaller deals, often privately owned Chinese acquirers as opposed to large SOEs. Sometimes minority deals. I think a lot of those types of deals seem to happen with sort of less kind of scrutiny than some of these bigger deals that may or may not be deemed to be threatening to national security. So I think and part of my experience looking at a U.S. domestic business in partnership with this Chinese private equity firm was a really great experience because the idea was to co-invest along with them and develop the company's operations both in the U.S. as well as in potentially in China. And I think those types of deals can get done, and but I do think that what we can do in the private sector, notwithstanding what the government needs or should be doing, is to gain that understanding. The long time periods, I just came back from Beijing a few weeks ago, just to meet with people, and I think that's very important to establish those long-term relationships and to meet the right people with the right networks to really get things done. That's obviously very important in China, and I think you have to start very early, meeting the strategics early, meeting the investors early, and gaining trust, maintaining a dialogue before you actually talk deal metrics. I think that's an important way and sort of a nuance with how business is done in the U.S. and something that we should, as U.S. professionals, focus on.
Thank you. Brenen, if you could maybe comment a little bit about what you see in the U.S. in terms of opportunity.
I would only add one brief comment. We've heard many times today that we're at the infancy of this exciting opportunity, and we know there are U.S. sellers that are interested in being acquired by international concerns, including China. We know that Chinese companies are going to be investing here, and I think it's incumbent upon M&A professionals such as us to help open up those pathways of communication. And that's what's exciting for me to be involved in China Connects and this panel and tomorrow's activities, because those concerns are out there. It's inevitable. It's up to us who are aware of this trend to begin to open up those pathways.
Yeah, so that Euan, you could maybe comment on that too, these forums like this, or we were just talking earlier.
We found them very valuable, and just in the same way, it sounds China and the US are strategic partners much more than we are strategic competitors. It's such a big and disparate, fragmented market. Actually, we don't really see, from my firm, it's slightly strange to think of this, but we don't really see any direct competitors at all. We work with all the other investment banking firms, anyone will talk to us anyway, and all the private equity firms and all the accounting firms and lots of lawyers, not just Selig. He's one of the better ones. But look, it's a fragmented market, and we're all in it together, and I don't think I need to persuade anyone in this room of that. If you could lobby your senator and your local politicians, that would be helpful.
Stephen, you're nodding. You want to comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. There was an interesting piece in the FT, I think it was this morning or yesterday morning, that along the lines of what Joyce said, that with June Collins and the high-profile transactions that didn't go through, that much of the activity is now focused on much smaller, under-the-radar type deals that are successful, and the opinion piece was that really China should be looking at taking the opposite position, doing more high-profile things, bowling the issue to the surface, because this is doing deals is a dance that needs to be learned, and from what I've seen, China has improved in sophistication greatly, and there's still a little ways to go, and I think that's going to help to get over the hurdles of some of the concerns from a regulatory standpoint. I can recall in the early 2000s, the first time I went to China to look at a company. It was a relatively small company in a rural city in China. And when I got to the headquarters, got out of my car, and two people ran up with cameras and spotlights just like these. And I thought, oh, what's these for? And they said, oh, this is going to be on TV tonight. And I thought, I haven't read the NDA that closely, but I'm pretty sure I'm covered against something like this, right? And so needless to say that the transaction didn't go through. Fast forward to where we are today, we're light years ahead there, but there's still work to be done in terms of, because we know the opportunities there, we know this is a phenomenon that will continue to march on, and I think before the two sides kind of work through the regulatory issues and get more comfortable, sort of the more you'll see transaction volume pick up.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I would just add one comment that right now, job creation from successful investments from Chinese investors, creating jobs even in small businesses here, is going to grease the political skid.
Al, do you have any comment on that? You know, having lived over there for a while.
Well, no, I want to go back to the comment a second ago about the cameras and everything. I think some of that's pretty common. The Chinese also have another idiom that I really like. You ready? You want to write this down?
That sleeping together thing.
This is a kind of a common mistake that we see on our side, where you have, it'll apply both ways, but it's a common mistake we see with American business people that want to go to China and buy. And the idiom is don't use the knife for killing an ox to kill a chicken. The meaning of that is that an American businessman often, the president of the company runs straight into the Chinese target and starts to talk about an acquisition. Now that can happen both ways, but the idea in Chinese negotiation is not to have the two presidents. In general, they probably don't know much about detail getting into that. Let that be done at the right level and then bring it up. So again, I snap back all the time to really understanding the culture and who you're working with. And the opportunities will come because there are people, Chinese Dialobon, big bosses with money that are coming over here. And it looks like they want to go to Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon and go back home, but they really do want to do a deal. The point is, the environment may not be just right. So it's very important to understand what's going on there.
I think in some sectors we're going to see some changes. For example, in the energy sector, if you look at the kind of investments that Chinese companies have made, it's been really as the non-dominant partner. So, for example, Sinopec's investment with Devon in development of their shale reserves, it is Devon that is acting as the developer. It'll make the ultimate production decisions, marketing decisions as well. So it's more of a participant, but kind of riding, if you will, in the vehicle and not necessarily driving it. I think if the CNOOC acquisition of Nexen happens, and it looks like, at least as of today, that it's well on track because Alison Redford, the Premier of Alberta, has recommended it, and it looks like the Harper's government and the government review is going forward. I think there's some lessons we can learn from that. That's that $15.1 billion takeover. But what are some of the stipulations here? That the jobs remain in Canadian hands, that the management of the board remain at least 50% Canadian, that the current levels of employment be maintained for 5 years. That's an increase over 3 years that was originally proposed. That clarification plans for R&D continuing then a healthy level of expenditure, and also commitment to environmental standards. So when you were talking before, Brenen, about job creation, I think as we see now that China can be an engine to help to develop industries and take them to another level of technology and to employ people, I think that model of Nexen, of commitments to remain in place, to maintain current levels of employment, healthy R&D, commitment to environmental standards, that may be a model for future acquisitions in the energy space, where Chinese companies will not only be a participant, but actually be the leader, the driver of the transaction itself.
That's really going into a deal with your hands cuffed, right? And you have to live up to all those rules. Euan, you had something to comment about that?
Yeah, I'm just gonna, all I wanted to say is China's kind of, it's a terrible thing to say, but China's like a bogeyman today for a lot of US politicians. And to overcome that requires not only good corporate practice and behavior, but it's a PR battle. And we see that in our clients all the time. You know, look, there's a lot of towns, a lot of cities, a lot of counties in the US that desperately need investment, employment opportunities, and yet all we hear about is terrible thing, offshoring jobs. No, you're responsible for offshoring. No, you've done more offshoring than me. Well, guess what? A lot of that offshoring happened for very valid reasons, and those jobs wouldn't have been saved otherwise. But the point is now, Chinese companies can do a lot of good in this country, and it's going to be a long, painstaking battle and require PR investment.
Well, actually, two more things actually on that Selig deal. If it happens, Selig has said it's going to make Calgary its North American headquarters and also list its shares on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So it's appealing to all these different types of constituencies, which I think is, to your point, Euan, it's a very large PR issue and battle, and you have to be, better than the best corporate citizen. You really have to show that you're in here for the long haul and you're prepared to invest in the social fabric of the country, the community itself.
I'll ask another question. I'll pose it to whoever wants to answer it. We talked about China's investment abroad, and I think we all agree that number is going to grow. Do you believe it'll grow next year in the U.S. in the years to come? We'll get a bigger percentage of that, and if so, why? And what part of that is going on today is just kind of campaigning, political rhetoric, and once the campaigns are over, it just kind of quiets down. Anybody want to touch that? Joyce, I'm going to give it to you.
Sure. Well, I certainly hope it does grow. Working at a private equity firm, with a few portfolio companies, it would be great to open the acquirer universe. As you said, I mean, U.S. and European strategics, haven't really been as active as we all would have liked them to be more recently. And, the IPO windows open and shut. Otherwise, you're selling to another private equity firm. It would be great to open that strategic acquirer universe and really involve more Chinese strategics, just given the amount of cash and the interest in investing in the U.S. So I certainly hope it grows. I think it will take a lot of work, both from the private and the public sector here, though.
Stephen, maybe you could comment a little bit about the election and your portfolio, and there's a lot of rhetoric going on. Is there any strategy with your group around that and after the election? And do you think foreign investment will grow?
Can I do that?
Please, Al.
I think my firm's fairly on the record on the elections.
And how'd you vote on that? It's being taped.
No, I think I think foreign investment from China, sort of either way, will continue to grow in the U.S. In terms of the elections and how that's going to impact the private equity business, clearly the candidates have sort of different views on, the industry, how to regulate the industry, and how the industry ought to operate, both in terms of how it makes its investments and even sort of what it does with its portfolio companies. I don't know that I will go out on a limb and say and forecast who will win the election, who will take the House, and but we'll see.
Can I just add a couple of
Please.
Chinese companies are already making a huge difference in M&A in the US, disproportionate actually to the amount of deals that are getting closed. So if you remember a few years ago, we used to talk about the China price. If you're in manufacturing in the US, I have to cut my price because Chinese can do it cheaper and my customers are telling me of it. There's a reverse China price for M&A today. We, BDA, are being brought in by lots of other investment banks routinely, because if you're a private equity firm today selling a $500 million portfolio company, you probably want to check whether there might be what they would often see as a crazy Asian buyer, okay, who'd come in and pay a nonsensical price to buy the asset. So we're being brought in routinely on M&A transactions to try and fish for Asian buyers. And even where, as is typically the case, the Asian buyer or the Chinese buyer doesn't win that auction, it makes a difference and it makes a better outcome quite often for the private equity seller in the US, because that seller has more confidence to ask the other buyers for an extra $10 million, an extra $30 million, because there's interest from Asia. So that's already happening. And just finally on when's it going to come, I can't predict when the trickle becomes a flood, but I suspect it's going to be quite soon. There's so much damn money, there's so much political will in China, there's so much increasing ambition. You know, Chinese companies suddenly saying, wow, our 10% GDP growth maybe doesn't last forever at that rate. Let's go and conquer the world now. And the government is avowedly talking about a look outwards strategy, you know, creating national champions. There's too much pressure for it not to happen. And for us, as advisors, trying to figure out where to put people, where to put our resources, the question is 5 years or 1 year from today? I'm absolutely certain, without question, within 3 or 4 years anyway, that Chinese acquirers will be routine participants and winners of auctions in the US. Today is very, very few and far.
So what we're talking about is this percentage that gets done in the U.S. is quite small, but yet this activity is quite big, and at some point that activity is going to turn into deals. Correct. Selig, do you feel the same way? You're seeing this kind of activity? And
yes, I think there's more and more, as Lawrence was talking about, in alternative energy, in wind and solar as well, in biotech. When we were talking earlier today, for example, the mayor from Toledo, he's looking to attract biotech, pharma companies, to his city. And Governor Cuomo also in the economic development zones upstate New York as well, looking for the future industries as well. So there's a lot of, if we look at the government and the local levels themselves, they see the benefits for technology innovation, for job creation that can be enhanced by having Chinese companies partner with them to learn the technology that they then will be able to bring back to China as well. You also have certain Chinese companies who have gotten to a size that they really they need to expand beyond China. You have the slowdown in China itself. So if they are going to continue their robust growth, they have to look to international markets as well. And that's going to require adherence to more international standards. So with Kuwait Technologies, for example, they were hoping to come into this market because as the second largest telecom manufacturer after Ericsson, they needed to expand. But yet, the issues of, notwithstanding their discussions with investment bankers about IPO, all the myriad issues of their structure and who actually owns them and what their relationships were stood in their way. So I think there's going to have to be a greater adherence to transparency, to international standards of governance, in order for Chinese companies, particularly in sensitive areas, to be able to play in the United States. But for example, with Kuwait, it wasn't just only the United States. Australia had blocked them also from making acquisitions on the very same security concerns. India as well. So I think there's going to have to be really a clearer demarcation of companies acting as companies as opposed to acting as government surrogates. And I think to Lauren's point earlier, the most current opportunity will probably be for privately held companies, where you don't have necessarily the same issues that are confronted by some of the large SOEs, particularly in these sensitive areas.
So we just have 5 minutes left. I'd like to open it up, if we have time, David, to the audience to maybe ask a question or two. The gentleman right here. You could stand up and just speak. Thank you.
You raised something interesting about executives who may have a conflict of interest. I'm curious how you deal with this when you're dealing with an acquisition. First of all, if you have an executive that you feel has a conflict of interest, how do you deal with that person? But more generally, you talk about NDAs in the context of a deal. Are they worth the paper they're printed on? Are people in the Chinese market receptive to them? Have you ever had to try to enforce one? Could you speak to that?
I'd like to take that.
Just as a start, you need to have it because you need to, insist that there is a standard of conduct as well. But there is a lot of concerns, particularly in China, as to the porous nature of information. Even in internal investigations that we were doing of China-based companies, one company specifically would not allow the information that would be necessary to the investigation to be turned over even to a Big Four accounting firm office in China, because they were just concerned that, frankly, they were not convinced that information would be kept sacrosanct. So we had to work it through, in fact, that the information would be made available not to that office in Hong Kong or Beijing, but to the office in the United States itself. I mean, there's a concern on both parts in terms of how you deal with sensitive information. The conflicts of interest I was thinking about are ones where if you're investing in a company, the loyalty of the CEO is not fully 110% in the company itself, because he may be a supplier to the company. He may be a customer of the company. He may own the land and the facilities in which the company is doing business, and that's really a big problem, because at the end of the day, how can you do an acquisition if you feel that there really is not necessarily an alignment of interest? Or perhaps, or if not an acquisition, a joint venture, or even as an underwriter, taking a company public. If at the end of the day you feel that there are many other ways that the CEO can maximize his earnings away from your company, given the fact that it's only one piece of his overall mosaic.
NDAs are an odd question, right? I think I've been an investment banker for 22 years, and I've signed a lot of NDAs. I don't think I've ever seen litigation on an NDA. I don't think I've ever seen anyone try to, take action because of a breach of an NDA, and that happens in the US too. I think there is, probably they take a bit less notice than in China than they do here on the whole. But I still agree with Selig, it's a necessary discipline to go through. You want to try and be sensible the way you document a transaction. But I'm deeply skeptical about NDAs in any market, frankly. I know that's heretical, but it's just from borne out by practice.
I would just add that to the extent we're dealing with a wholly owned division of a Chinese firm that's already in the U.S., then our clients are fairly comfortable that the NDA is going to be adhered to. And we've asked if they can keep it at that level for certain periods of time, and we've been able to do that.
We have time for one more question, David. There you go. One more question. Go ahead, gentleman there. Thank you.
For the banking side, which side do you like to represent for China side or US side for cross-border transaction? That's the first one. Second question. If you're representing Chinese company, how can you monetize such transaction? Are you charging retainer fee? Are you charging percentage after transaction success? Number three, besides 100% acquisition, there's any smart structure which is going to be good for Chinese company or more attractive to Chinese company when they're doing acquisition here?
Number one, I like to work for whoever pays us well, and traditionally that's been US companies, not Chinese companies. I think I understand the reason for your question, which is historically there's much less practice. It's less typical for Chinese companies to retain investment bankers. I think historically in China people use informal relationship networks, guangxi, whatever. There's a trusted uncle or a lawyer that used to be a friend of the company rather than an investment bank. I hate to say this next point, but historically when Chinese companies hired investment banks, they cared about brand labels, so they would often prefer to use Goldman Sachs than BDA. I don't know why, but that is often the case. It's changing, and we're putting a lot of effort to winning work from Chinese companies. We make sure cross-border deals take longer, either direction, typically takes a year, and I can't justify putting 3 or 4 brilliant young people who cost a lot of money to work for a year in the hope that there's a success fee at the end. So we insist on taking a retainer on any buy-side transaction. If you want to sell an asset and you're determined to sell it, then maybe I can live without taking a retainer, including in China. Monthly fee on the buy side. If you're working for the buyer, if you're working for a seller, we'll live without that. Anyway.
Would you like to touch that one? There we go.
Equity guys won't pay retainers anyway. Just as bad in the US as in China.
You don't pay on the back end.
The WL Ross guys never paid a fee in their history. 25 years of successful business, 0 fees today.
Oh boy. One more question. We have time. Go ahead, gentleman in front.
I would ask the tough question, which is the issue raised earlier in passing by Professor Lee. How have you dealt with issues of local corruption in China?
All my time in China, we're fairly used to things like homebao, red envelope for through distributors, paying for orders, etc. It's fairly, I mean, it can be common, and it's not bad. I'm not saying the Chinese are bad here. It's part of the culture. And I mean, you know, make money while you can. So in general, what we did was you never started it to begin with, and never get involved with it for the second step. Used to be, before the DOJ, and you guys can answer this a lot better than I can, because I'm just a manufacturing guy that had to deal with the salespeople or the general manager. An arm's length was okay. Now that's no longer true. Now you can be 3 arms lengths away. If you know that there's money under the table for something, you've got to deal with that. So the only thing I can tell you is you're never involved and you don't get it started. And that's it. If somebody would ask for some kind of a compensation for a deal, you have to just turn a deaf ear to it. And that'd be my only answer, is you can't get it started.
I mean, I think on the due diligence list, put down the FCPA investigation, because you need to understand going in exactly what you're inheriting. And that is a cultural difference as well. You know, oftentimes the payments are not going to be for specific accommodation, like for an environmental official to turn his or her IOA, but it's just part of the culture that at holidays and whatever, you know, you show your tribute to municipal leaders and the like. So that's, again, something that really has to be looked at and thought about, both in terms of remediation and to be able to put in place processes, procedures to deal with those issues.
I think that's true. It's amount. You know, I mean, there's amounts that enter into play. You know, 10,000 renminbi for Chinese New Year may not be appropriate, but there is an amount that is. So you need to be well versed in how to do that.
I think, Selig, to your point, it's part of the process. I mean, I was involved before I did Merrill DataSite with buyouts, and when we bought American companies, I mean, we hired investigators to do a complete thing on the company and the board, and you know, you find things, and it's not always clean. It's part of the process. So, anyways, we're going to end it now. I want to first of all thank M&A Advisors for bringing this group together. The panel, they do a great job, and I think we're early on here, and it's always fun to be part of something early on because it grows and it continues to grow. And I want to thank Selig for hosting us here. By the way, this has all been taped, and each person has been individually interviewed, and it'll all be hosted on Merrill DataSite, our library, so you can go back and look at this and whenever you like. So again, thank you, David, and thank you, team. Thank you.